to see people join.
It is.
Where everybody's from.
Welcome everyone from various parts of the world. My name is Mel Duncan and I am one of the co-creators of Nonviolent Peace Force and currently work as our Director of Advocacy. Today I am in St. Paul, Minnesota in the United States, and I am very angry. Our community had another police murder on Monday night. An unarmed Black man by the name of George Floyd, who was handcuffed, was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer. So even during this time of pandemic, Black people will continue to be lynched by public officials. This is a time not only for us to be active, but to be actively anti-racist. To join in the streets of Minneapolis and other cities to protest this kind of ongoing brutality. And as Elizabeth pointed out earlier, the irony that peaceful protests are being met with tear gas and rubber bullets, while armed men who storm state capitals in the United States see no resistance whatsoever. You will see in the chat box various things that you can do in addition to joining us in the streets. And I encourage other people who are listening today, if you have access or activities or resources that people can access, please put that in the chat box today. Today we are in a state of chaotic transition, all 7.8 billion of us in the world. New realities and new futures are being formed. Some of those, as we see, are increasingly authoritarianism, ethnic nationalistic, suppressing of human rights, and the mega corporatism and its required militarism. And there are other directions that are being shaped. It is a time for us to really rely on each other, to trust in humanity, to practice anti-racism and nonviolence. We can and are helping create the transformation. There are little notes of more viable models that are emerging. And today we have two women with us who are helping to shape those models. We have Elizabeth Shackelford, who will be introduced in more detail in a few moments, who showed personal accountability in standing up and giving her entire career up for truth and integrity. And first I want to introduce Tiffany Easthom, who is the Executive Director for Nonviolent Peace Force and who has been a major shaper of creating viable nonviolent alternatives to violent interventions. And she does that in big ways, but I also want to honor the little tedious ways of work that she does every day to make sure that budgets are run and that personnel matters are handled, and all of those things that go unnoticed but are still equally as important as the more visible activities that we have. Tiffany will be leading us we'll be interviewing Elizabeth for the next 35 minutes. And then we will take 25 minutes for questions from each of you. And I ask that you put your questions in the chat box. Everyone will be muted because we are very fortunate to have so many people, 93 at this moment, who are with us. So please type your questions in the chat bar. We will be closing at the top of the hour. And then after that, I invite any of you who have the time to stay around for another 15 or 20 minutes for a more informal conversation. So I am very, very proud, as always, to now turn things over to Tiffany Easthom.
Great. Well, thank you, Mel, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining. And it is my great pleasure to be able to have this conversation together with Elizabeth Shackelford, or Lizzie, as she's more commonly known. I had the great Lizzie and I have a shared experience of having been in South Sudan at an overlapping time, at a very complex time when the war broke out around that time. So we go back to that period of time, and we have some shared experiences and shared understanding. So having the opportunity to get to talk to each other and to learn more about the book that she's written it's thrilling for me, and it's a great opportunity. As you know, Elizabeth has written the book, The Dissent Channel, which has recently come out, and served as a diplomat for the US. And she was in South Sudan, and then she was in Somalia, and then very famously and became very well known for her resignation that became quite public and very an ethical and an act of integrity approach to why she chose to resign. So there's so much to talk about here, and so many things that we need hours and hours to catch up and to learn all about these experiences. So I'm going to keep it really brief and keep it light on formalities, and then dive right in. So I think everybody's really keen to hear your story, Lizzie, and we take it from there. So, I mean, you've written this book, you're talking about your experience in the Foreign Service, and maybe to warm us up, can you just start us off with sort of, talk us about, when you decided to join the Foreign Service, what took you into that? What was your decision making about that? And then what were your expectations of what that would feel like, that work? And then just take us right through to where you came to South Sudan and how did the reality compare to your expectations?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Tiffany and Mel, and it's really great to be here with so many people. It's exciting to see. Great to share the story with you all. So I will start right as Tiffany suggested. I, like many people that are probably in this virtual room right now, at a younger age, was rather idealistic and naive about the role that the United States government played in the world. Seriously, I could call it hopeful. But I had spent some time working around the world in my younger years doing kind of legal and regulatory reform work. I was a lawyer at the time, and I was working on international development programs mostly with USAID. So basically going out there and trying to help improve laws in different countries. I had stumbled upon this basically because I thought it was exciting to travel and I wanted to do good. So in my travels, I came across a lot of people diplomats in the State Department in a number of countries. And that's when I first started thinking, okay, we're spending a lot of money and investment on development programs. Is that really where I could be most useful? And the idea of being a diplomat, honestly, I really hadn't known much of what that meant before, but I thought, okay, this sounds pretty interesting. And began the long, rigorous process of taking the Foreign Service Officer test and writing the essays and doing the in-person interview. And I didn't have grand expectations, but at the time, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State and was doing a hiring surge as one of the many kind of stumbling attempts to rebuild our diplomatic corps to a better size. So I got in. And I assumed that as this young diplomat, I would be out there making good policies that made the world a safer and better place for democracy. I believed all of it. And we'll go through the discussion on kind of how that changed in my mindset. But I will leave you with the suggestion that it still is possible, but we are not there yet as a country and as a government. But my second tour, when I first entered the Foreign Service, I aspired to go to Juba. I thought, what could be more exciting than a brand new country? And when I joined, South Sudan was just a few months away from launching their independence with a referendum. Sadly for me, Juba was not on the list of options we had for my first tour. So I went off to Poland instead, where I was what you might more typically think of as a diplomat in a European city living in a fairly nice, apartment building, talking with government officials all day, and kind of a nice place to live. Then, as I got prepared for my second tour to bid on my next tour, Juba was on this list of 100 places we could kind of bid and order. And I thought, well, that sounds wonderful. It's a new country at this stage, but it's going to be really hard to get in because I bet everybody in the Foreign Service wants to go to South Sudan. As it turns out, that's not true at all. Practically nobody wanted to. So I was awarded the bid that I had selected. And in 2013, only a couple of years into my time with the Foreign Service, I arrived in Juba for what was a one-year tour as the human rights officer, but also the consular officer, which we can get into that if people are interested. It's basically at least 2.5 jobs and one small junior officer. And I arrived about a week after South Sudan's second anniversary of independence. And from Washington, D.C., everything I was reading was about how hopeful it was and what a great path they were on and how this was a success story. And it took almost no time on the ground after I arrived to realize that that just was not the case at all. And that was kind of the beginning of where we start in the book.
That's great. And I want to share with everybody, experiences. I met Lizzie in the field, and I want to invite you to talk about. I shared with you the other day a story of remembering you sort of dealing with the weighted responsibility of the consular services at the time the war broke out. So could you talk a little bit about sort of what your expectations were and what you saw from a U.S. foreign policy perspective in South Sudan when you arrived? And then take us through those first days, those first weeks of when the war started and what that meant for you.
Sure. So, when I had arrived, the narrative in South Sudan was, from the outside picture was still, this is a success story and look at how much progress we've made. The US government was planning things like an investment conference where they were inviting American businessmen and women to come over and find things to invest in and businesses to start. That was kind of the stage that people were assuming we were at in terms of nation building there. But what I kind of started to see unravel in the first few weeks was that there was this developing kind of political battle in the ruling political party of South Sudan. And there was an increasing kind of authoritarian nature to the president and the people around him in their attempts to try and kind of limit any threats to their continued power. One might think of this as, it's a political game in a lot of ways. An election would be coming up in a couple of years and who is going to challenge the president. But in a nation like South Sudan, that can be really destabilizing if some people don't necessarily want to give up power at some stage. So I watched over weeks and months, kind of seeing the fault lines in the foundation of this country. And I got a lot. I was a human rights officer, so I did a lot of reporting on what was happening with intercommunal conflict in different parts of the country. And I started to see more and more of these issues that had been around for a long time of violence against civilians by security forces primarily. And that was when I started to think, this is a government we're really supporting. How do they continue to have these activities? And there might be statements against the violence and, diplomatic calls for the government to hold those accountable who had abused civilians, but nothing was really happening. But where I really got to see more of it was in my role as a consular officer. Most embassies have an entire consular section. They have several officers, they have a lot of local staff. They have, and they're dealing with visas, passports, and American citizen services, which is helping Americans in distress, Americans who are sick, Americans who've been arrested, Americans who have died in the country. And dealing with those, personal incidents, trying to help people get access to lawyers when they've been picked up by the National Security Service. Trying to help families get bodies of loved ones home if people, missionaries die in the field, which did happen from time to time. But that was where I started to really see how things interacted in the country. And I started to get a sense that we weren't always, as the US government, using the influence we had to to press for better action, you know, in the small things on the front lines. You know, you have someone running around in military or police uniforms in the capital city, and they're killing people and robbing people. You know, you need to do something about that. And if nothing's done about that, then the impunity really grows. I don't want to get totally off topic, but it is extremely relevant to what's happening in America today. What I kept seeing happen in South Sudan in those early months was that bad acts were being met with impunity. No one was being held to account. And so the violence and the threats to the civilian population were growing and growing and growing. And our continued support for a government that was not protecting its civilians, I believe didn't necessarily lead to the war. And could we have stopped the war? I'm not sure, but we certainly could have played a better role in pressing for better treatment of the population and more accountability and rule of law. So this is the environment that I'm seeing as we lead up to December of 2013. I kid you not, 1 week before the war broke out, we did hold that investment conference that we were sponsoring with the South Sudanese government, literally 1 week before the entire city just shredded. And we were waiting for something political to happen. There was a big event over this weekend right before the war began, which was the big convention of the ruling political party. And in a scenario like that, political differences, if there is no real functioning rule of law and accountability, political differences can be enough to break everything down in a society like that. And that is what happened. What you had was a political disagreement to which the government essentially quashed dissent against it with violence in the city, which spread out across the country. And the night after the end of this political event, violence broke out in a couple of places in the city. And within 15 hours, we basically kind of saw the writing on the wall. It was a Monday morning when the embassy was shut down. We'd had personnel meeting throughout much of the night, including me, in the ambassador's house, trying to decide, is this an incident that will settle down? Will it become under control? Or is this the beginning of war? And a lot of us feared, that was going to be the beginning of war, as it was. But for those who don't really know how embassies work in these situations, you can think about what's going on right now with evacuations of Americans back to the United States, for example. When Americans are in harm's way in crisis situations, one of the first things that the US government does is try to help those Americans. So our first couple of weeks really were consumed with evacuating Americans out of dangerous parts of South Sudan, at first Juba, but then other parts of the country, and getting them to safety. And we evacuated. That involved long days at the airport, negotiating with authorities there, and trying to get people who were at the most threat out of the country before they were in harm's way. We evacuated, 1,100 people. You would think I would have that number off the top of my head. But that was the beginning of the war. And as Tiffany knows, a lot was going on in the city at the time. Thousands of people were killed in the first few days.
Yeah, and you talked about that experience of being in the airport. And for those of you who are not so familiar, the Juba airport has been long rated the worst airport in the world, and which of course gives its pros and cons, mostly cons, but pros in as much as you can get a lot of access and you can do a lot of things in that airport in ways you can't. So, you talked about this standing in the airport, and one of your jobs was trying to determine if somebody was an American or not. And then did they get the opportunity to evacuate? Can you just tell? I think we've got lots of people from the US here and might find that interesting.
Sure. So we don't have a lot of policies on how you run an evacuation, particularly in a wartime situation. We have a very short part of the Foreign Affairs Manual. It's like this long. It doesn't have much detail. And it basically says, when we do an evacuation, you prioritize getting Americans and their families out first. And beyond that, basically, you can do whatever you want. But Americans and their families sounds like a very clear thing, but it's not at all, particularly in a place where we literally had people who fled with the clothes on their backs and arrived at the airport without passports. For those of you who follow South Sudan, you might be aware that there are a lot of, there are a lot of NGO personnel there, UN personnel, missionaries, business people, but there are also a lot of dual nationals, a lot of South Sudanese who fled wars in the past, many of whom then came back after independence because they wanted to help their country rebuild or newly build their new country. So it was a challenge to figure out, a lot of Americans would often keep their passports close by. Folks like Tiffany and I learned that in the field. You're usually ready to go if you need to be. But many people who arrived didn't have passports. They might have been destroyed in their houses. Their neighborhoods might have been under assault by security forces. So we had to find ways to help to decide who got on a plane. One of the benefits of Juba being one of the most poorly run airports in the world is that it was a little bit easier to fudge things than it might have been. I can't imagine going to Dulles and trying to talk somebody through immigration on like my assurances alone. I'm not sure that would work. But in early war times in South Sudan, we had a lot of relationships with folks at the airport that did help us work our way through. So you had, for people who didn't have passports, literally myself and a couple of colleagues would conduct consular interviews with them at the airport and try to suss out if what they're saying to the best of our ability was true, or if they had just come and shown up and are pretending to be someone else who is an American in our system. So these are really challenging things to do because your job is to make sure that you get enough Americans out. But it's really hard to look somebody in the eyes and be like, your story doesn't hold up at all. I don't think that you are American. And that means that you have to go at the end of the line, to be considered with the extra seats we have available. And for people who are really upset, that was a hard conversation to have. But, we were able, because we did so many flights, we were able to get other people out as well. And we did to the best of our ability. So we had hundreds and hundreds of people who showed up on day one trying to get a seat on a couple of planes. And we would have to decide if they're, are these your children? It might sound really obvious. You let the kids on the plane, but if you have no proof that those children belong to those people who are trying to take them out of a country on a plane, you have to ask yourself these questions in real time. Like, do I want to accidentally facilitate child kidnapping? Because that's a real thing that happens in crisis situations. So these are the types of things that we were trying to deal with, in person, by asking questions, by making phone calls. But we didn't even have internet access at the airport. We had radios to call back to the residency, and I had a little Nokia cell phone, so I could phone a friend on my Nokia and ask someone in Nairobi if they could look up a name and number for me and describe how they looked. So those are the types of resources you're dealing with. When we first arrived, that first morning of evacuations on December 18th, we had forgotten even to bring like a table and chairs. By day two, we had a table and chairs, and then we decided it's really sunny, we need some kind of umbrella. Little things to think about, but you're spending 8 hours, on the equator in the middle of the hot season. You're probably going to do better work if you have a little bit of shade. But it's day by day, we learned the lessons and we honed it better. And we built confidence in the community that was there, that we were trying to do the best we could to help people. And, having that human to human interaction and explaining to the groups of people there what we were trying to do, asking them for patience. It was really remarkable to see how well people responded to that. So I'm not sure if that fully gives you the picture of standing in a dirt parking lot, trying to rush before curfew to get the last number of people on a plane in a war zone. But yeah, if you're wondering what American diplomats are doing out there right now, a lot of them are trying to work that out with airports that are probably a little higher bar than Juba to navigate.
Thanks, Lizzie. Yeah, it's a good insight into sort of the range of things that a diplomat can be called upon to do in very complex circumstances. I want to sort of bring it back to the U.S. foreign policy. How do you see a disconnect between the U.S. policy and the reality on the ground? So where did foreign policy fall short?
Well, my biggest takeaway was that we were looking at short-term kind of a short-term timeline and trying to hold on to the success story that we had built. The success was supposed to be independence, and South Sudan got that. And after that, I think that we took it on faith that we'd gone in the right direction and that we could just kind of keep forging ahead with supporting the government that we had been. I think there was a lot of wishful thinking. I think that we willfully looked away from mistakes early on because we were so hopeful that South Sudan was going to succeed. But where I believe we failed was in tolerating a total lack of accountability, not just from independence, but in the wake of the Second Sudanese Civil War, which was the one that gave rise to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which launched the referendum for independence in South Sudan. I mean, during that second war, you had mass amounts of violence between the Southerners, a lot of atrocities committed against civilians. And at the end of the day, those are the ones who rose up and were running the government of the country. It was wrapped into the peace agreement that there would be accountability and truth and reconciliation efforts, but none of that was really pursued because it wasn't a priority. And because of that, once you fast forward to 2013, you had a very traumatized population that had suffered greatly under different sides of the leadership and the opposition now that emerged after the war broke out. And those fault lines, those traumas, made it very easy for political players to manipulate communities into basically coming together as part of their fighting machines. I believe strongly that if more effort had been made for reconciliation and accountability, even before independence, that it would not have been so easy to foment that kind of that level of violence that we ended up seeing.
And Lizzie, I want to come back to a comment you made in your opening remarks that I think is so relevant to what's happening today. Is you're talking about immunity and you referenced sort of how it is relevant to what's happening in the US today. Just now that we've had a little chance to talk about it a bit more and warm up a bit, can we come back to that point and really talk about how impunity and other conditions, well, we see it on the news, and those of us, particularly those of us in the Western world, think those are things that happen in other countries that are not so well developed as ours. And then here we see what's happening with what Mel very, eloquently described as this horrific situation in the US. And so how do we sort of tie together what is a foreign policy presence and what's happening domestically and recognize what those connections are?
It's so much clearer to me today, the connections than I think would have been the case, even just for me personally a few years ago. And part of it, like a major theme, one of the key themes in my book is that unchecked accountability, like unchecked violence and unchecked bad acts and impunity will only lead to more and more bad actions. If you don't enforce accountability for bad acts, then lessons aren't learned and people don't change. Governments are people. Armed groups are made of people, and people, whether you're talking about U.S. government personnel, U.S. leadership in South Sudan, or an unruly teenager. If you allow any of these humans to get away with acting poorly, they will continue to do so. And that's really what we saw happening over and over again in South Sudan. Nobody stopped it. Everybody kind of hoped, well, it will get better because they're not that bad. But without, these are lessons learned, right? Like it's learned behavior. So the government of South Sudan learned over time that they were going to be able to get away with these actions. And I feel strongly that that's what we're seeing in America today. We have had patterns of behavior and a complete lack of accountability. And we see that with the police violence against people of color over and over and over again. It's the exception to the rule that someone gets charged and actually convicted for these acts that are, entirely uncalled for and unjustified. The fact that we continue to question whether this man who was killed this week, whether his family will see justice done for those who killed him. The fact that that's even a question for us is really remarkable and shows you where we are. But I also see it with the tolerance level for things like, exactly as Mel mentioned, the heavily armed men storming a Capitol. You saw it with, out west a few years ago when you had a militant group, that's what they are, a militant group in the western part of the United States take over a government building. And yet that was just kind of peacefully resolved, and they were not, had it been anyone other than, frankly, white men, it probably would have ended differently. So how we act towards behaviors, how we reinforce what people are allowed to get away with and what they aren't, shapes what we're going to have to live with through the future. And whether it's in our foreign policy, tolerating partners and friendly governments to to treat their civilians horrifically without any accountability, or whether it's here at home, if we allow domestic groups to continue to terrorize others without them being held to account, we will continue to face that because those things don't change.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I want to fast forward a little bit. So you're very famous, quite well known for your resignation from the Foreign Service. And can you talk a little bit about this? And it's been framed really nicely as a question here from one of our participants, Maz, who really is talking about where working inside the system is no longer possible to make a difference, and it doesn't feel viable. Can you talk about how you came to the decision, and what prompted you to make your resignation, and how was that for you, and what is your advice to other people who might find themselves in a similar situation?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time, and a lot of my friends in South Sudan who knew my frustrations with our foreign policy there know that there were times I thought about resigning long before this current administration. I felt as though I went through every step that I could to change the direction of our policy on South Sudan, and yet as a junior officer, I felt like I couldn't make traction, and like those around me who had the same views also couldn't make traction. But ultimately, I didn't decide to resign. I planned to stay the course because I felt that even though I disagreed with the approach that we took in this particular country, I felt genuinely that the leadership of the State Department and our leadership in the White House, everyone had the same goals. We might have different timelines that we're looking at how to address it. We might have different views on how you reach those goals. But I didn't feel that anyone there had different kind of overall values than I did. And I felt that we all understood the goal of the State Department and our role in defending national security and working towards safer and more prosperous globe. I think we all were on that same page. So I was ready to just work my way up through the system and try to get to a point where, I had a lot more to learn. I was still quite early in my career. But under this current administration, I stayed for about a year, and it wasn't one single act that made me just wake up and say, okay, I'm walking out. It was death by 1,000 cuts. It was just this constant deterioration of my faith that I could stay on the inside and continue to do good, and continue to work towards the ends and the reason that I had joined the Foreign Service in the first place. But, it was the big things. It was the Muslim travel ban. I was working in Somalia at the time, one of the countries that was a target of the Muslim travel ban. It was the difficulty of trying to, face my counterparts there and explain to them what this was about. And it was small things like the fact that our UN and, Somali and European and other counterparts that I worked with in Somalia, no longer felt that they could listen to what we said in country and know that that really reflected what the government was going to do, because what we were doing in the field, was not being kind of respected and paid attention to in Washington, and any decision point could be changed overnight with, a tweet, which did happen in several places. So for me over time, and particularly working in a place like Somalia, where we have a lot of kinetic military activity, which I already had, a high level of discomfort with. Being in a place where US actions really do mean life and death, I didn't feel comfortable that I would not be complicit in acts that were really not just undermining our national interests, but really, harming innocent people. So, that was the conclusion that I came to for myself. I worried that the longer I stay there, the more likely it was that I would become complicit. My advice to other people who are still in, because by no means do I want everybody in the federal government to walk out. I think that would be an absolute disaster. But my advice is every day reevaluate what you're doing in your job day to day, whatever agency you're with, whatever level you are in the hierarchy. And if you feel confident that what you're doing is you're able to do more good towards the goals that we're promoting than bad. If you're able to do more good on balance than bad, I think that you should probably try and stay and continue doing good, because we're going to have a lot to pick up at the end of the day. But I think that if you can't be confident of that, people should really consider what their contribution is by staying.
Great, thanks. And I'm just keeping an eye on the comments and questions that are coming up, and sort of that they're falling under a couple of groups. One is there seems to be some interest around sort of US military involvement, and related to that, issues around accountability and impunity. So we talked about concerns about seeing other governments act with impunity, but also what does that look like for US operations abroad? And then there's another group of questions that is really around like civil society, alternative approaches, and things that you've seen. So can we start on the military engagement side, speaking from your experience as a diplomat and being in these countries, seeing what that engagement looks like, and your thoughts around what's the way to address issues related to, or are there ways that we could address impunity both for US actions as well as other governments?
Yeah, I think there is a lot that we can do. A starting point on the US military approach is that, and I think this is an opportunity for the next administration. It is high time that we do a complete reassessment of all of our military engagements around the world. I mean, we are present in 800 places around the world as our US military. I mean, that's hard to fathom. But that means in all of those locations, our first face to the world is a military face, and that has consequences. That in and of itself, that the optics of that alone can contribute to greater instability in places where it helps feed into the narrative of those who are trying to destabilize the place. But so I do think that the starting point is to assess what we're doing and why we're doing it in all of the places where we have a military. And by that, I don't mean the Pentagon does an assessment. I mean, we do a civilian-led assessment on what we're doing in these places and why. In terms of accountability, there are two different levels, at least, at which we need our military to be more accountable. And in order to do that, we need it to be more effectively led by civilians rather than the military taking the lead. I would say that happens on an individual level in terms of individual activities. Drone strikes in Somalia and civilians who are killed in these. We have this administration has eroded what little accountability we really had in areas such as civilian deaths in US military actions. So on those individual levels, we need to be making it our policy that we do a follow-up and we determine whether or not we are doing, again, more harm than good by our acts, and that we are accountable for the innocent lives that are lost in them. And then I think on the, that's kind of just an example of the individual level of accountability. And then there's the big picture accountability, which is what is the impact of these international interventions that we're doing? You think back to in December, if you might recall, the Afghanistan papers were released, which were essentially a reminder that what we've done there really hasn't been effective and has failed multiple times over. And yet that news of our efforts in Afghanistan doing far more harm than good really went under the radar. That should have been a massive, kind of congressional investigation into why we did the things we did and why we didn't learn any lessons along the way. And my concern is that if our foreign interventions, if we're not accountable for the impacts of our foreign interventions, we're going to continue making the same mistakes. So in terms of what other actors, I think this is kind of where you're going with the next question, in terms of what other actors can do, I think that NGOs, groups that that track and try and bring light to the negative implications of our interventions I think that's incredibly important work. I mean, you see the work of, I'm trying to think of who it was Amnesty International that revealed the recent deaths of civilians in airstrikes in Somalia. There are a few organizations that do it, and that's the only time that it becomes, you know, something that Congress is even aware of. So I think that that type of work, that type of investigative work, which is really, really hard to do in a place like Somalia, it's really hard to do work into, you know, research into civilian deaths in places like South Sudan. Those groups need support in order to demonstrate, in order to bring this information to light. And we also need to insist that our own government does its homework on that too. My last point I will say on that, pardon, is it's incredibly important for individual people to be part of this as well. You know, make sure that your congressmen and your representatives and, you know, your governments outside of the US, you know, make sure that your governments know that you pay attention to that and that it is an issue that matters. Because if the people care about what we are doing out in the world, then governments will care. That's how it works in a place, you know, in a democracy. So I really think that's important. I also don't want us to, Tiffany, when should I have a small excerpt. Speaking of wonderful groups that do incredibly important work. So I've got my beaten up copy here.
I think you're referencing to the part about NP in your book. Is that right?
Yes.
Great.
So,
that was going to be my next segue. So I was going to ask you, we're talking a lot about military interventions and harm to civilians and alternatives. And you saw NP's work on the ground. And you know that our approach is really looking at alternatives. So civilian-led unarmed strategies, looking at conflict prevention, conflict management, and the protection of civilians in these situations. And you gave us some great feedback. And for if you don't know already, Lizzie did include a little anecdote about some of our NP work in the field. So yes, Lizzie, I invite you, please.
Okay, all right. So, and this little section doesn't do it justice, but I'm sure you can learn more about this from NP, but this is just a small part. So it's April 2014. So this is a few months after the war began. In April, war was no longer a crisis, but the new normal. Although that month saw an uptick in violence in a way we hadn't seen since the very start. In Bor, several hundred Dinka youth, interspersed with SPLA soldiers and other armed men, marched on the UN compound, blew open the gate with a rocket-propelled grenade, entered the compound, and attacked the IDPs, the internally displaced people. Dozens of unarmed civilians were killed, and some UN peacekeepers were injured attempting to repel the attack. The diplomatic community, myself included, was rather surprised they had managed to fire back at all. Unsurprisingly, the state news broadcast that night claimed the incident was caused by UN personnel opening fire on peaceful demonstrators. The press offensive against the UN didn't let truth get in the way of a good opportunity. Inside the compound at the time were 2 protection officers for Nonviolent Peace Force, a plucky international organization that goes to the most dangerous places on earth and deploys civilians to help locals stay safe. At first, I found the group's approach of unarmed civilian protection naive, but I became a convert, impressed by the concrete local accomplishments under dire circumstances. And the protection officers did it all bravely, as proved by Derek and Andres, the Nonviolent Peace Force officers in Bor that day. When the base came under attack, they sheltered in a mud hut with 14 women and children. During hours of siege, armed militiamen entered the hut 3 times and stuck rifles in their faces. They were even threatened with an axe. The gunmen commanded Derek and Andres to leave, saying they would kill them if they didn't. They only wanted the women and children, they said. Derek and Andres knew that they meant it. The lives of these women and children would be lost if they complied. So they didn't. They refused. They told the gunmen they were unarmed, but that they were there for protection. They had nothing but their presence to offer. Eventually, the gunmen left for good, and all the lives in the hut were spared. The protection officers' presence in that hut wasn't planned, but it was what they trained to do, and it was the reason they were there, and it worked. Their example gave me a needed boost of hope and humanity.
Thanks so much, Lizzie. I was in South Sudan when that happened. It was 6 years ago, and hearing you read that still gives me goosebumps and takes me right back to that day. It was very impactful for all of us. And I think that, I mean, and one thing, and I like to tell people who you know, especially feel very burdened by some of the decisions the current administration is making in the U.S. and all of that, is that, and you know, we knew each other while you were working for the Foreign Services, that the U.S. government does provide a lot of support to this type of work at the field level. Certainly in South Sudan and some other locations where we work. Yeah, Myanmar and hopefully soon in other places. So it's not all bad news, and there is good work being done out there. There's questions around how do we restore diplomacy to its rightful place? So it's another sort of civilian-led unarmed strategy, is really working with diplomacy that seems to have fallen away in recent years. What would you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's important for people to understand that diplomacy has been, I mean, really hammered and broken down under the current administration, but it's been under siege for decades before that. Ever since the 9/11 attacks, really, there's been this very active shift to a military-led approach to our interventions. And, you know, it started out that, you know, the State Department and USAID were not kind of properly resourced to do a lot of the kind of nation building activities that you saw in Iraq and Afghanistan needed at the time. So because the Pentagon had all of the resources, they just decided that the Pentagon could do all of these activities. So instead of having, you know, folks out there meeting with the local government who look like me, you have folks out there meeting with the local government who are dressed in military fatigues. Instead of having people out there, you know, veterinarians out there who are from like the development sector trying to do development work in different communities, you have military veterinarians out doing trainings on, I don't know, cattle or whatever it is they do. But the Pentagon has been, you know, its budget has just grown and grown and grown. And it's, you know, it is, in terms of that short-term thinking that we often have with our foreign policy, it's quick. It's a quick fix. Just send some troops to go answer whatever that issue is in that area where you've got some, you know, kind of local conflict. But the truth is that short-term thinking it's done a few things. Because we continue to send the military, we have less and less reason to boost up our diplomatic and development personnel. And because the military keeps being the ones out there, they're the face to the rest of the world. They're in far more places and far more visible than your diplomats and development personnel. So it's really changed shifted what the view is of what American intervention is. And it's shifted the view back in Washington of what we were likely to do. Over time, the influence of the State Department, which should be doing the lead in our foreign affairs and our policymaking, has really started to recede behind the influence of our military. And that has huge implications, you know, for the very simple reason that if your problem solver is the military, it's going to be much more likely to default to what the military does. And militaries do war. And that is one of the reasons that we are engaged in so many places. But we need for Congress to do more of its own civilian oversight. We need for we need for much more clout in the kind of decision tree to go to the State Department. And when you have decisions over where we deploy, you know, civilian foreign affairs leadership needs to be involved in that much more than they are now.
Great. Well, thanks, Lizzie. We're rapidly coming to the end of our time here, and thanks for answering all those questions. And it's so interesting to hear your reflection from a Foreign Service perspective and how much it really resonates with the way we from an NP perspective really look at it. Somebody wrote in the chat window here, Maz, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that's a great way to encapsulate this moment and that observation. So the last time you and I were together was in a little restaurant called Rainbow in Juba. It was just a few days before you left South Sudan, and now here we are years later, and you've written a book and you've taken your message and really taken an opportunity to use that experience and really be a voice of principled stance and integrity. And I congratulate you on this, wish you all the success with this book, and look forward to being able to support you in that way. So thank you so much for your time, We're going to turn it back over to Mel, but I just really wanted to really thank you and congratulate you.
All right. Well, before we give it to Mel, can I wrap up with one thing, Mel? I just wanted, remembering that last time that I saw Tiffany in person at the Rainbow, which was a mediocre little restaurant with a dirt floor, I had asked her to meet up before I left because I wanted to let her know that I was heartbroken and crushed to leave South Sudan in the state that it was in right then. And having worked and invested so much in it over the last year, to leave it when it was in such a crumbled position, feeling like we'd done so little, it felt very demoralizing. So I had decided for myself that I wanted to decide what I could do as an individual, not as a diplomat, but as an individual. What could I do that would be the most impactful, help the most South Sudanese victims of this war? And I decided that donating to Nonviolent Peace Force was the single most impactful thing I could do. So I called Tiffany up to come meet me so that I could let her know I was taking, it wasn't some huge amount of money. It was a chunk of my danger pay and hardship pay for the last year that I wanted to dedicate to the cause. And I felt like it would do the most good with Nonviolent Peace Force. So I have been so grateful to get to know that organization, and really, really encourage any of you, if you want to do something to make a difference, please support this great organization.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. That's great. Thank you. Mel, can I turn it back over to you? He's been muted by the host. My dear NP colleagues, whichever one of you is logged in as the host, can somebody unmute him?
Yes, working on.
Working on it.
Oh. Okay. Mel, can you unmute now?
We could try and read his lips. What I believe Mel would say at this point. Something very moving.
I'm sure Claire is working on it. Oh,
Okay.
There we go.
There we go.
Everybody,
right.
Mel Duncan.
I do want to point out this is not the first time that my colleagues have wanted to meet me and keep me that way. Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you, Lizzie. I think, Lizzie, that you demonstrate the kind of diplomat that we want and need and will have in the future. And so I look forward to seeing you represent us once again when we do have more humane and compassionate approaches. As you said, if your problem solver is the military, then they will do what militaries do. On the other hand, if your problem solvers are committed to nonviolence, they will do what nonviolent activists do. And that's what we all need to remain committed to. What we do in our foreign policy matters. And when I say our, I mean in the United States, but other countries as well, because the violence that we foist upon other countries come home to our neighborhoods and to our streets. And that's what we're seeing in Minneapolis today. You can purchase Lizzie's book, and I do highly recommend it, The Dissent Channel. And you can buy that right now at bookshop.com, not Amazon, but bookshop.com. And I'd like to let people know that you will receive a signed book plate from Lizzie for a minimum donation to NP of $25. So as anybody who talks to me knows, we need the money. And so if you can make that donation, please do so now and continue to do so. We will look for future nonviolence cafes. We will continue to offer them. And in the meanwhile, pay attention to the wonders that are emerging at the fringes of the impossible. They are happening and they are extremely significant. So I would like to close us now and invite anyone and everyone who would like to stay on and be totally unmuted for an ongoing conversation for the next 20 minutes, please remain and we can continue to talk. So again, thank you to Lizzie and to Tiffany and to Gilda and Marna and Amy and Claire and everyone else who worked to put this event on. Thanks. So let us all be unmuted now.
I'm here scrolling through the questions we didn't get to.
Great.
Hi, Lizzie. This is Monica.
Hi, Monica.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I just want to thank you so very much for your book. It's been very therapeutic for me, and I really appreciate it.
For those who don't know, Monica did some incredible work in South Sudan.
Yep.
We were working there at the same time. She was there long before I was, but.
Good to hear your voice, Monica.
It is.
It's great to see you both.
Monica very famously rescued a puppy from South Sudan.
That's true. And much more.
And much more.
Yeah, right. I do feel like I had the chance to write the book. I mean, I wasn't alone in the way that I felt about a lot of this stuff. So many of my friends and colleagues had the same concerns. And so I feel like I was able to capture a lot of that for a lot of people who had experience, you know, there and in other places similar to it, but particularly with those who had the experience in South Sudan. I saw a question from Fatima, who I worked with on, she was with the UN Children's UNICEF, and I got a lot of important information from her throughout my time there. She was incredible, but she asked about, you know, what if, like, for the embassies, how much role does the embassy really have? What can they do to hold parties to account? And, you know, the US government doesn't have the role of imposing on people. You know, you can't tell another government you have to do X, Y, or Z. But when we're pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a country, that is leverage. And if you choose, you can use that leverage to say, you know, sure, we'll do an investment conference, but we want to see those soldiers arrested who killed those civilians before we do that. Those are the types of activities that and approaches that I would have liked to see more of on even a very granular level. And particularly after the war started, we were still supporting the Ministry of Defense, you know, and other parts of the governments, and that was helping them with their war fighting efforts. So that's kind of accountability that we can do. You know, we can't arrest them, but we can change our behavior towards them. I want to hear any questions from anybody else who didn't get them out there. It's hard to read through the whole chat thing. I want to hear from other people.
I think people can unmute themselves.
Okay.
So if you have a question, unmute yourself. Otherwise, keep yourself muted.
Yeah. Can I ask something? I have sort of a question. I'm Jerioth. Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Hello, everyone. I am Jerioth. I am not in the USA. I'm in Italy, but I come from Cameroon, the English-speaking part of Cameroon, and we all know that. No, not all of us. Those who know, in Cucina. Those who know, I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Now we are in a civil war also in Cameroon, the English-speaking part. And we've been trying all this while, those who are engaging and asking for foreign intervention. And listening now to Elizabeth recounting her experience, I'm a sort of, okay, I have some fear, because when you call for help, you expect that those who are coming to help you, they should have some level of accountability. They should have some level of, you know, helping and resolving the conflict, the problems. But Now I'm a bit of confused, and I'm asking myself how exactly, it's not as if the USA has accepted to send the military, because the USA is still engaged with the Cameroon government, although last year they said they were withdrawing some funds. But again, this year we discovered that they still have some engagement. They are still supporting the Cameroon government in other ways. And the Cameroon government uses all this money to buy arms to kill the civilians in this part of the country. So it's not really easy. It's not really easy, from what we've discovered, that diplomacy, we don't really understand it. But again, I'm asking myself, so in this case, how do you really ensure that those who are coming in to help, if finally they decide to help, how do you ensure that they really help protect these civilians? Because the civilians are caught up now between the separatists and the government. And so how do you ensure that these people are being helped? Because that is why the military will be sent there in the first place.
I think that you raised a really important question, and it's not just when groups are seeking help from the US government, but it's a similar question if you're seeking help from the United Nations and from lots of other places, because any group entering a kind of a military fray or a violent armed conflict, you're often going to have that risk that they're going to end up contributing to it as well. I think there's no silver bullet to make sure of it, but I think that trying to constantly raise awareness, document things that happen, and speak to the groups on the ground who can inform. We've got to make a bigger push for accountability in US interventions and all international interventions. And there's no quick solution to it, but we've got to raise awareness. So for people like you in a place that is suffering from that kind of violence, make sure that people that who can get messages back to, whether it's the embassies, the UN, and back to Washington, D.C. It sounds a little bit silly, but individual stories can really make a difference with, congressmen and senators who have some kind of connection there. I get these questions all the time from people, and I'm like, if you can find a dual national Cameroonian American citizen who can reach out to a congressman and say, this is what we're worried about, that's probably the quickest way to get attention drawn from the people who can force some form of accountability. It's not a great answer, but it's really probably, until we get a better culture of accountability, it is the best solution. But we've got to work on the culture of accountability. I also saw a question from Ann Wright, which I'll quickly take. I don't know, somebody can cut me off if we get to some point and I have to shut up. But Ann Wright, for those who don't know, is a former US diplomat who resigned in protest of the Iraq War. She's written a lot and done a lot of activism. And her question is, have I gotten much support from former colleagues at the State Department? Because it's a real toxic environment right now, as it was in a lot of ways during the Bush administration. There's certainly some naysayers, but by and large, my community of former colleagues, those who are still there and others who have left, have been incredibly supportive. Kind of early on, I've certainly gotten questions from people on like, why didn't you stay and work from the inside? But I think people have a better understanding now that that is really easier said than done. I've had people who've told me that I'm just trying to build my profile and get attention. Some folks who are still at the State Department, but it's not a big group, I would say, by and large. And it's been so reassuring to me, both from the book on South Sudan and with my resignation letter and things I have published since. Most of the people that I really trust and cherish and respect in the State Department have generally said, thank you for saying the things that we all can't say, because we're still on the inside trying to do this important work. So generally it's been pretty supportive, which has been great, because it was something that you worry about.
If I could respond quickly to Jerioth, there are nonpartisan ways to deal with violence against civilians. And even during this pandemic time, we, for example, have been able to provide unarmed civilian protection training for activists in Burundi in the run-up to their election last week. Next week, we start training civil society leaders, especially youth in Darfur. And so even during the pandemic, when we can't travel, there are things that we can do. And so please contact us.
I will contact you. Thank you.
That's such a great point, because I mean, yeah, you can't trust the US government to necessarily do the right thing. The best you can do is get as well armed as you can to, you know, to push for yourself. So again, another reason I love Nonviolent Peace Force. So some commentary on the 2016, yes, for those who know a lot about South Sudan, see Carrie Grunlow's message, which is completely true, in the chat about another major disaster in US decision making, which I do write about in my book, so check it out. Carrie, if you're interested, I was actually in the room when John Kerry stated that he was going to be, that basically Riek was out and Taban was in, and it was a horrifying moment for me.
You said what?
Yeah.
What was
In 2016, the government of South Sudan attempted to assassinate Riek Machar, who was by that point, the leader of the opposition. And so he fled for his life from the peace agreement arrangements. And the government then said, well, if he's fled, then I must replace him with, you know, a stooge who is going to support the government. So it basically split apart the government of national unity. And I was actually in a meeting, it's all detailed in the book, when Secretary of State John Kerry came out to Kenya and to meet with some South Sudanese government officials. And he surprised everyone by saying, oh, of course, Riek cannot return, and endorsed the replacement of him in this government of national unity, effectively making the government of national unity just the government side. So it was a very classic example of a short-term decision made by the US government that had massive implications on prolonging the war.
That was invisible from the outside.
So much was.
It's hard to argue that you have an inclusive process when you come out and you do something like that.
Absolutely. So many wrong turns where things could have been different. And that's what I try and relay in the book. It's not, you know, it's not that I think we should go in and tell the government what they should do, but there were moments when we had influence and we used it to shift in a direction that was expedient, but for the long term, very damaging.
Simonetta?
Hello, Elizabeth. I live in Spain. I'm Italian, and I work in an NGO that has been working, has worked for a long time with NP. I would like just to bring a hopeful note to what you have said, which I do think gives hope, because it is civil society which will be able to change things. There is a big movement in Europe and among civil society to bring this accountability issue to the UN, especially the one in Geneva. So the human rights sector and has been working a lot on the conflicts, especially in the Middle East, to sort of bring out the fact that privatization of warfare, when the state the state forces come out, is one of the horrible things that are happening, because they, being private, have special, will know better than anyone. So what I mean is, I do hope that this goes forward too, as part of a civil society push towards this need for accountability. in the violence sector. And then as civil society, we would continue to work in the nonviolent way as we all wish and want to. Thank you very much for coming to us today. I was very happy to be able to hear you.
Thank you. And thank you for raising that point. I do think, if things are going to be done, it's going to be a wave of public interest in making change for things like accountability, and civil society is the only thing that's going to drive that. So it can feel really demoralizing at times because you don't have the power of governments, you don't have the power of armed groups, but that's the power that you have, and you have to use it, and it does make a difference. And seeing this many people signing up for this kind of event to talk about this subject, that also gives me hope. People are working on it all over the world.
Can I just follow up with a comment, just building on what you said there, Lizzie, about civil society and accountability, is also reminding us all that accountability looks different to different people. So a lot of us sort of really think about accountability from a justice perspective, a legal justice perspective, and that certainly has a role to play. What I also is important to remember that the voices we really need to listen to and who need to get to state what does accountability mean to them are those who are most affected by this kind of violence. And that can mean really different things in different places. And we've certainly seen that in NP in our community level work, when the community is able to articulate what justice means to them and accountability means to them and work together to reach that, even though it might look different than what some of us would think from different countries. If it works for them and they feel healed and resolved and able to move on, that's critically important. So there's the really obvious headlines, news level pieces of justice and accountability, but that also means that there's just thousands and thousands of opportunities for that kind of work to be happening at all different levels, down to the smallest microcosm of community in conflict affected countries.
Let's take about five more minutes. And all the questions don't have to be for Lizzie. You can ask questions among yourselves, make comments, whatever you want. But let's take till 20 past the hour.
I have a question. How do you think that we could get U.S. government members to be less tied to weapons manufacturers? Such a strong lobby, and many go from being a CEO of Raytheon to being, in government and vice versa. And so it seems, to be a very close-knit relationship. Some of the newer Congress members are trying to call that out a little bit more, but any more thoughts about how we can move that forward?
That's a really great point. It is the level of kind of legal corruption in the US governance system is extremely high. And I have to say, I do align with a lot of what Elizabeth Warren has revealed over the last couple of years, both in her run for president, but also before that. She's been fighting these corruption, these kind of corrupt challenges that we have for many years. And I think that one of the solutions is that we have to shut the revolving door between government and these big businesses, not just in all of these defense industry, but across the board. Because it's probably most deadly when you're talking about the defense industry and weapons sales, but this is a similar problem you see with the pharmaceutical industry and healthcare industry, hospitals, privatization, even schools. So fundamentally, we need to take away all of the temptations for legislating based on personal financial interests. That's going to be a huge shift, though. And it's never going to really succeed until we get campaign finance reform in the United States, because every problem we have with governance comes back to the fact that everybody has to basically sell themselves to get elected. That's for a much longer, more complex discussion on a separate topic, but it's related to everything, because fundamentally in the United States, big businesses, including the defense industry, which is a massive business, have an absolutely insane influence over what our laws are that are passed. I'll leave you on that question with one little tidbit of information, which is that our line item budget for Lockheed Martin, a single defense contractor, is almost bigger than the budget for State Department and USAID any given year combined.
Final comments. Anyone want to have the final comment, please? Okay. Well,
sorry, I have
okay,
one.
Charles, go ahead.
Sorry. Has NP, like, is there any way that we could get celebrity, you know, some kind of celebrity to tweet about NP? You know, sometimes conversations can start to change, like George Floyd. So many celebrities and athletes are saying that this is not ever okay anymore. And maybe if NP could get a celebrity sponsor or two, that could help open up the dialogue.
Well, we would welcome anyone who has access to celebrities. The third most asked question I ever get when I speak is, have you contacted Angelina Jolie? So please, if you have connection to those celebrities, please let us know. At the same time, our celebrities are the people at the community level, are the people at the grassroots. And those are the people that we will continue to focus on. So I thank everybody for joining us in this conversation today. Look for the next Nonviolence Cafe, which will be forthcoming. In this country, a message, in the United States, a message to our politicians to underscore what Lizzie just said is corporations are not people. And we need constitutional and legislative assurances that corporations are not people. So with that, thank you, everyone. Continue fighting nonviolently. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.